Aloha mai kako, and welcome to Mystical Rose Oratory. My name is Brother Brandon Alana, and it's my privilege to serve as the Masters of Ceremony for today's Marianist Lecture. We begin our time together asking for God's generous blessings upon us, and so we do so in prayer. We call upon the name of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, O great wisdom from above. Come and open our hearts to the knowledge you reveal in the beauty of creation. May our minds be open to the truth that comes to us in sacred stories and ancient proverbs. May we learn from each other how to carry within our hearts the compassion and tenderness of Jesus. May we learn from Mary, his mother, how to carry hope and the promise of a future full of life. We pray that you come and dwell within us, both now and forever. Amen. The Marianist Lecture is the signature academic and mission-oriented event of the year. It is sponsored by the three entities on this Kalaepohaku campus, namely the Marianist Center of Hawaii, St. Louis School, and Chaminade University of Honolulu. I want to give a special welcome to the leaders of these three institutions: President Lynn Babington of Chaminade University, President Glenn Medeiros of St. Louis School, and Brother Bill Campbell and Brother Dennis Schmitz of Marianist Center of Hawaii. Mahalo. A warm welcome to Deacon Weaver, who is here with us, and the deacons and deacon candidates of the Diocese of Honolulu. We're glad that you're with us. We're also glad that Father Diego Restrepo is in attendance as well. We also like to welcome the students and faculty of St. Louis School, the students and faculty of Chaminade University, and members of the Mystical Rose Oratory Sunday community. We're also glad to have with us Brother Ed Brink and our Chaminade scholars. And finally, we would like to welcome all of you who are joining us this afternoon via live stream. Aloha and welcome. We also would like to acknowledge the culture of this place that we find ourselves. So please allow me in welcoming Kumu Kaipo Leopoldina of St. Louis School, who will offer our Hawaiian Oli. Anopale na ole kumu. Thank you very much, Kumu Kaipo. Before we introduce our speaker this afternoon, I would kindly request that you please ensure that your cell phones or other devices are indeed in the silent or off position. Thank you very much. I'd like to call to the podium Dr. Dustin Ragasa, who is a graduate of Chaminade University and earned his doctorate in theology from the Graduate School of Theology in Berkeley, California. He currently serves as the director of Chaminade University's master's program in pastoral theology. Welcome, Dr. Ragasa.
On behalf of the Marianist Center of Hawaii, St. Louis School, and Chaminade University of Honolulu, I would like to welcome you, Father Dan Haran, to our vibrant and loving community here on Hawaiian land. Daniel Patrick Haran is a member of the Order of Friars Minor, lovingly called the Franciscans, and earned his PhD in systematic theology from Boston College. He serves as the director of the Center for Spirituality and professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. He previously held the Duns Scotus Chair of Spirituality at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. A columnist for the National Catholic Reporter, he is the author of 13 books, including Catholicity and Emerging Personhood, a Contemporary Theological Anthropology. It received the 2020 First Place Award for Theology book from the Association of Catholic Publishers. His latest book is entitled A White Catholic's Guide to Racism and Privilege. In this book, Father Dan asserts that it is incumbent on white people to educate and challenge each other, and to speak the uncomfortable truth in loving and direct words, a task that he acknowledges has been the burden of people of color for much too long. His next book, which will be available on November 18th, is The Way of the Franciscans, a prayer journey through Lent. Father Daniel regularly lectures around the United States and abroad, serves on a number of university, academic, and publication editorial boards, including the St. Bonaventure University Board of Trustees and the Franciscan School of Theology Board of Regents. He is also co-host of the Francis Effect podcast. Now, I follow him on Twitter at Dan Haran OFM, where he posts and retweets really cool things. And in fact, on Friday, he retweeted the apology from the Canadian bishops for their mistreatment of the Indigenous peoples there. So, my community, please join me in inviting the inaugural recipient of the Mackey Award for Catholic Thought, Father Dan Haran, to deliver the 2021 Marianist Lecture.
Aloha and good afternoon. I want to thank you for that very kind introduction and for the very warm welcome. I also want to acknowledge that I'm a guest visiting this beautiful land and community from the North American mainland. And therefore, before I offer my remarks this afternoon, I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is part of the larger territory recognized by Indigenous Hawaiians as their ancestral grandmother, and what we in the Franciscan tradition refer to as our sister, Mother Earth. I also recognize that Her Majesty, Queen Liliuokalani, yielded the Hawaiian kingdom and these territories under duress and in protest to the United States to avoid the bloodshed of her people. I want to recognize as well that each moment that I am in Hawaii, this land nourishes and gifts me with the opportunity to breathe her air, eat from her soils, drink from her waters, bathe in her sun, swim in her oceans, be kissed by her rains, even when it's unexpected, and be embraced by her winds. I further recognize that generations of Indigenous Hawaiians and their knowledge systems shaped Hawaii in sustainable ways that allow me to enjoy these gifts today. For this I am grateful, and as a guest, I seek to support the varied strategies that the indigenous peoples of Hawaii are using to protect their land and their communities. I also wish to express my gratitude to all those who have made possible for me to visit here this afternoon and these days surrounding today, especially Chaminade University and St. Louis School and the Marianist communities here. I want to especially thank Father Marty Solma, Brother Dennis Schmitz, and all the Marianists who have shown the warmth of aloha and a wonderful sense of hospitality and fraternity here. I also want to echo the gratitude that Brother Brandon offered to the leadership of all three entities. Given the topic of my presentation this afternoon, I'm mindful that for a visitor such as myself, who is a temporary guest to this sacred place, the spirit of aloha is not to be presumed or taken for granted, but always earned and received in humility. I come to this land with deep respect, in a spirit of openness and with a desire to learn, and I thank you for the opportunity to offer some reflections, and I look forward to the discussions that follow today and beyond. The theme of my lecture this afternoon is primarily centered on the life and work of the late Trappist monk and author Thomas Merton. Though he died prematurely at the age of 53 in 1968, his understanding of the complexity of various and intertwined systems of injustice were ahead of his time, especially when we consider that he was a white, cisgender, straight, male, Roman Catholic monk, priest, and writer. A lot of intersecting privilege there. He also had a haircut, and I feel at times very much at the same intersection of that privilege, because we are baldies together, on top of all those many other identifying characteristics. Motivated as I am by the call of the Second Vatican Council for all the baptized to interpret the signs of the times in the light of the gospel, I find myself continually drawn to this unusual historical figure and spiritual master. Merton intuited the inherent relationship between the spiritual life of contemplation and the evangelical mandate to put our faith into action. For as the letter of James boldly reminds us in the New Testament, what good is it if someone says he or she has faith but does not have works? Faith of itself, if it does not have works, is dead. This ability of Burton to offer insightful social criticism informed by profound spirituality led our Holy Father Pope Francis to identify him in 2015 as one of 4 luminary Americans, alongside Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and Dorothy Day. Not bad company to keep. The Pope pointed them out as worthy for our consideration and as people who might serve as sources of ongoing Christian inspiration. About these 4 figures, Pope Francis said, "These men and women offer us a way of seeing and interpreting reality." And about Thomas Merton specifically, the Pope noted, and I quote, "Merton was above all a man of prayer, a thinker who challenged certitudes of his time and opened new horizons for souls and for the church. He was also a man of dialogue, a promoter of peace between peoples and religions." And the Pope added that Merton was an exemplar of, and I quote, "the capacity for dialogue and openness to God." Among the manifold ways Merton's spirit of dialogue and openness to God continue to challenge us in our own times are the ways he engaged the topics of racism and creation. Given that these 2 themes very sadly continue to be among the most urgent, I say sadly because just the little tip of the iceberg I hope to share of Merton's reflections sound today as if they were written this morning. Not much has changed. My focus this evening is on how Merton's insights and challenging vision can offer us a Catholic response to the timely matters of racism and climate change in particular. But before I get to the heart of my reflections this afternoon, I want to spend a moment in recognition of the particular context in which I'll be delivering these remarks, that is, within the Hawaiian setting of its own distinctive history and experiences of colonialism, racism, and environmental degradation. I am in no way at all an expert in the history of colonialism, the colonization, or the manifestations of structural racism in Hawaii. However, as someone committed to the importance of ongoing conversion, scholarly integrity, and the work of anti-racism, and what we theologians call the preservation of dangerous memories, I've tried my best with my limited experience to learn from Native Hawaiian scholars and experts. I want to acknowledge as well that Merton did not address the colonial history of Hawaii in his particular work, though he was born 2 decades after the forced annexation of this land, and he himself was alive and a monk and writing during the American push for statehood. Merton's focus was primarily on the prevalence of anti-Black racism in the United States mainland in particular, though he did address the parallel plight of the indigenous peoples of the North American mainland in a series of essays that were eventually collected in a small volume. I'll say more about that in a moment. With respect for the differences among indigenous peoples and nations, there are nevertheless resonances in Merton's thinking about race, colonization, and injustice that I think will resonate with the experiences and histories of Native Hawaiian people. In particular, Merton was attuned in an unusual way for a white man of his time to the failure to honor the wisdom, heritage, beauty, value, and dignity of cultures, traditions, and religions that are not part of a Euro-American hegemony that came with the colonization to this and other lands. Merton was also aware of the epistemological sclerosis of the dominant caste of white Americans who could not, or maybe better put, would not, bother to acknowledge the multiple ways of learning and seeing the world apart from their own limited frame. This hubris resulted from and reinforced the predominance of white supremacy as a cultural reality and the foundation for much of the American experience, which blinds those who benefit from such racial injustice from seeing their own complicity and privilege, blinds me as one who benefits from such racial injustice, oftentimes from seeing my own complicity and privilege. In this sense, Merton's analysis of the complexity and the consequences of anti-Black racism resonates with the enduring colonial realities that are detailed by scholars who study the Hawaiian culture and traditions and history. Additionally, as I hope becomes clear in my presentation, Merton's own sense of the sacred kinship of all creation aligns well with what is expressed by many Native Hawaiian communities about their ancestral creational worldviews. The familial framework, familiar to many Hawaiians, is deeply resonant with that of the best of the Christian tradition, such as the scriptural, and I can't help but point out, Franciscan spiritual influences that helped shape Merton's own thought, which are also often subjugated and willfully forgotten by many of those who are shaped by the Euro-American heritage and view and deride such profoundly Christian frameworks as, quote, pagan or, quote, unchristian, which is to say, quote, un-American and, quote, un-European, and so on. I know it's hard to believe, but the Franciscan tradition has been called, unwittingly, especially in the age of Pope Francis's ministry, these horrible terms as well. In this vein, I believe that Merton, who would have nodded along approvingly and respectfully to Professor Trask's comments when she writes, "My people believed that all things had spirit and indeed consciousness, and that gods were many and not singular. Since the land was an ancestor, no living thing could be foreign. The cosmos, like the natural world, was a universe of familial relations, and human beings were but one constituent link in the larger family. Thus gods had human as well as animal form, and human ancestors inhabited different physical forms after death. Nature was not objectified but personified, resulting in an extraordinary respect when compared to Western ideas of nature, for the life of the sea, the heavens, and the earth. Our poetry and dance reveal this great depth of sensuous feeling, of love for the beautiful world we inhabited," end quote. Now, apart from the recourse to polytheism, which I don't think Merton would necessarily have nodded along with, I know he wouldn't have, but he would have appreciated the respect of the ancient ancestral traditions. The interconnectedness, the interdependence, and the non-human animal agency of the whole of God's family of creation all echo that of the best of Christian theologies of creation, even if your average Christian wouldn't be able to identify or articulate these realities as easily. Merton understood them very well. And so while I will not explicitly limit my engagement today to the Hawaiian context, since Merton did not in his own work, I do hope that what I share from his still timely insights toward a spirituality of justice provides material for further reflection on the Hawaiian history and the local response to both systemic racism and climate change. One last brief note. Thomas Merton, as I mentioned, died in 1968, which means he was very much a man of his time, for better and for worse. One of those things that may be in our contemporary era recognized as for worse is the limitation of his awareness of the way language functions. And so some of the terms he uses, in particular around gender and race, are not the terms we recognize as acceptable or respectful today. For instance, rather than African American or black, he uses the term Negro often in his writings, which was commonplace in the 1950s and 60s. And when it comes to gendered terms, well, he was a result of the patriarchy. It's a lot of he and him for God and for humankind. And when possible, I will try to be as inclusive, but I want to signal that from the outset. On August 23rd, 1961, Thomas Merton wrote a letter to his friend and his spiritual companion, Dorothy Day, the co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. In this letter, Merton expressed his ongoing discernment about the direction of his thinking, writing, and vocation. He said, and I quote, "I don't feel that I can, in good conscience, at a time like this, go on writing just about things like meditation, though that has its point. I cannot just bury my head in a lot of rather tiny and secondary monastic studies either. I think I have to face the big issues, the life and death issues." This sentiment reflected the shift in Merton's attention from the interior life toward a greater interest in the social justice concerns of his time. Racism was for Merton more than a series of discrete actions of prejudice or harm. Although he certainly recognized the reality of particular instances of physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual violence deployed against individuals and communities of color, one of Merton's most notable, if often overlooked and underappreciated contributions, was his ability to recognize and name structural racism, or what Father Brian Massengale, professor at Fordham, has called the culture of racism that permeates historical, cultural, and institutional realities throughout the United States. As Massengale explains, quote, "Racism at its core is a set of meanings and values that inform the American way of life. It is a way of understanding and interpreting skin color differences so that white Americans enjoy a privileged social status with access to advantages and benefits to the detriment, disadvantage, and burden of persons of color." And Merton, while white, male, Euro-American, straight, ordained, and Catholic, and who died in 1968, recognized and named this pervasive reality for what it is, a form of structural and systemic violence. His contributions anticipate much of the contemporary developments that followed in the decades after his untimely death. I believe that Merton's awareness of the complexity of racism in the U.S. arose from the intersection of several factors that converged in his unique position. One factor was his voracious reading habits, which put him in contact with writers including that of the turn-of-the-century author W.E.B. Du Bois, his contemporary James Baldwin, and Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. By way of illustration, we can look to Merton's 1967 article, "The Meaning of Malcolm X," which was originally published in a Catholic theological journal. Here, Merton offers an extended reflection on the autobiography of Malcolm X, in which he argues for the importance of reading Malcolm X's own writing, rather than relying on the picture presented by the mass media of his day, a picture of Malcolm X that Merton describes as wholly inadequate. It seems evident from the nuanced, if not entirely uncritical, reading of Malcolm X's autobiography that Merton's outlook on racial injustice was shaped in part by Malcolm X's personal narrative. The most striking part of this short essay is the way in which Merton acknowledges Malcolm X's critique of populations ostensibly sympathetic to the black struggle for racial justice in America, populations that Merton had likewise identified as white liberals. He doesn't mean liberal like you hear the pundits today talk about liberal and conservative. Here he's talking about those in the North in particular. Merton lauded the call to reflect critically on even the seemingly generous support of civil rights causes by whites who are often ignorant of their own subjective or implicit bias and their consequential condescension, a theme that echoes throughout Merton's call for white Christian transformation in particular and approaches to constructive civil rights advancements in the United States in general. Another factor was his work with Christian nonviolent movements, which put him in contact with, in addition to Dr. King, the Berrigan brothers, Dorothy Day, Jim Forrest, John Howard Yoder, Pink Ferry, and many others. The Catholic activist discussions of working against violence, poverty, and war intersected with Merton's horizon of interest in the civil rights movement. Like Martin Luther King Jr., many of Merton's other interlocutors and conversation partners and colleagues were not engaged in silos of sectarian or exclusive interest, but increasingly recognized what we might call the intersectionality of the Christian work for social justice. A third factor, and I think this is important, was the deeply mystical and contemplative discipline of prayer and reflection he cultivated, especially as he embraced a more eremitical, a more hermit-like lifestyle in proportion to his social justice work. It's curious that near the end of his life, Merton withdrew more and more even from monastic daily life into hermitage, and it's at the same time he became more and more engaged with the struggles for justice in the world. It should get us to think about what it means to live a life of activism and seek a spirituality of resilience. In this way, we might liken Merton to the great Protestant theologian, preacher, and activist Howard Thurman, who in the estimation of both Bill Apel and C. Vanessa White was also a mystic as prophet. They were both kindred spirits. By becoming a person committed to the practice of spirituality in the Christian tradition, particularly as it concerned being increasingly imbued by the narrative of sacred scripture, Merton's outlook reflected that of both a mystic, and when I say mystic, I mean one who recognizes the proximity of the sacred and the divine in everyday life, and a prophet, by which I mean one who sees and decries the disparity between the way God intends us to relate to one another and the reality of our actual living experience. Speaking as a white male in the context of American religious life and addressing an audience of similar composition, Merton noted his complicity in structural racism, separating it from discrete acts of racially based animus while also naming its inherently violent roots. And this is what he writes at one point. And bear with me, it's a long quote. Merton says, "There is, however, such a thing as collective responsibility and collective guilt. This is not quite the same as personal responsibility and personal guilt, because it does not usually follow from a direct, fully conscious act of choice. Few of us have actively and consciously chosen to oppress and mistreat the Negro," Merton says. "But nevertheless, we have all more or less acquiesced in and consented to a state of affairs in which the Negro is treated unjustly, and in which his unjust treatment is directly or indirectly to the advantage of people like ourselves, people with whom we agree and collaborate, people with whom we are in fact identified. So that even in theory, if the white man may believe himself well disposed toward the Negro, and never gets into any bind in which he proves himself otherwise, we all collectively contribute to a situation in which the Negro has to live and act as our inferior. I am personally convinced that most white people who think of themselves as very fair," he uses quotes, "to the Negro show, by the way they imagine themselves fair, that they consider the Negro an inferior type of human being, a sort of minor, and their fairness consists in giving him certain benefits, provided he, quote, keeps his place, the place they have allocated to him as an inferior." Merton continues, I would like to say that this state of mind is itself an act of inhumanity and injustice against the Negro, and is in fact at the root of the trouble with the Negro, so that anyone who upholds such opinions, even in the best of faith, is contributing actively to the violence of the present situation, whether he or she realizes it or not." End quote. Merton added that this kind of treatment is part of a whole subtle system of moral and psychological oppression, which is essentially violent. Anyone who has such an attitude is then partly responsible for what's going on, and in that sense is guilty. The relationship between the particular and the collective, as it concerns the violence of racism, anticipates what numerous scholars have said in the decades since. Father Massengale affirms Merton's intuition that much of the violent and subtle system of moral and psychological oppression, as Merton puts it, functions as a largely unconscious or preconscious frame of perception developed through cultural conditioning and instilled by socialization. Massengale explains that racism's manifestations change, sometimes dramatically, but at its core, racism always involves the use of skin color differences for the purpose of assigning social rank or privilege. The shifting iterations or manifestations of racism can lead people to dismiss its enduring and persistent reality, claiming that improvement is actually the eradication of racism in society. There's been a lot of reflection and discussion on that in recent years. The so-called post-racial U.S. that some people, I think falsely, if aspirationally believed, happened when we elected our first president of African descent. However, as Merton, Massengale, and many others note, racism is only one side of the coin of structural injustice. The other side is the privilege, the benefit that is preserved and protected by racial injustice. While many white women and men readily admit the reality of racial injustice when it disadvantages some, far fewer of people who look like me are able or willing to recognize our own advantages resulting from the very same system. For many whites, the notion of white privilege appears theoretical, especially when we consider the matrix of class and gender and race coming together in the lived realities of individuals. Now, just as an aside here, I talk about this often, and sometimes other white people get really angry. I can't imagine why. And some folks will come up to me with good intentions but defensiveness and say, you know, I grew up in a very poor family. I grew up in a very rural context as a white woman, a white man, and a white family. What is this privilege you're talking about? What are these benefits? Where's my share? And I find myself reflecting more and more on the challenges of that term. White privilege leads people to think that there's some kind of card you get or debit card you can cash out. And I think it's helpful for people who are in contexts like mine to think of it less as something you get and more of something you don't ever have to think about or deal with. It's a snowplow of sorts that allows you to go through life. There are lots of examples, and I hope we have time to have conversations if people are interested in that. I have too much to say that's prepared. I'm realizing time is flying. So, as Massengale notes in the American context, and I quote here, white privilege is not an abstraction. It is real. White privilege is the range of unearned and at times unwanted advantages that come simply from possession of an attribute our society prizes, namely the status of being considered white. Merton recognized the reality of white privilege, which arises from a society structured such that supremacy is bestowed on whites by virtue of law, custom, culture, and social systems. He takes particular aim at white Christians in their willful ignorance about white supremacy. Merton writes, "The actions and attitudes of white Christians all, without exception, contain a basic and axiomatic assumption of white superiority, even when the pleas of the Negro for equal rights are hailed with the greatest benevolence," end quote. Merton adds, and I quote, "It is simply taken for granted, since the white man is superior, that the Negro wants to become a white man," end quote. In other words, what he's saying here is he's saying out loud the things that are culturally represented in the experiences of whites in the U.S. context. in the structurally racist thinking of even those white women and men who, in principle, support civil rights, especially in the 1960s when Merton's writing, or in our own day, there is still an insidious undercurrent of white supremacy that governs what society will accommodate, when it will accommodate, and for whom it will accommodate those rightfully demanding racial justice. Merton recognized this dynamic of the simultaneity of racism and white supremacy at work not only with African Americans, but also with many Native Americans. A connection he draws out in that small book I mentioned from 1968, the title of which is Ishi Means Man, Essays on Native Americans. Merton describes the disturbing false benevolence of the reservation system as part of a larger system of identity erasure and the elevation of white Euro-American culture. He writes, and I quote, "The real confinement, the real reduction in unmanning, dehumanizing, maybe better put, of the Indian is the reduction to a definition of him not in terms of his essential identity, but purely and simply in terms of his or her relation to us. More exactly, a definition of him or her in terms of a relationship of absolute tutelage imposed on them by us. This is, of course, extremely significant not only for the Indian, against whose human identity it is an act of systematic violence, but for ourselves," end quote. Merton then makes this claim more starkly when he offers a summary of the significance of this dynamic of white supremacy instituted in our society as it affects Native Americans in particular. And I'm going to quote again, and I want to emphasize, I'm going to shout for a minute, and I'm doing that because Merton writes in all caps for about 4 sentences. So this is my only performance of the night. He writes, "But let us spell out clearly what this means. It means that as far as we are concerned, the Indian, like the Negro, the Asian, etc., is permitted to have a human identity only insofar as he or she conforms to ourselves and takes upon himself our identity." All caps. And then he goes on. "But since in fact the Indian or the Negro is in a position of having a different colored skin and other traits which make him unlike ourselves, he or she can never be like us and can never therefore have an identity. The lock snaps shut. The Indian, like the Negro, though perhaps less emphatically, is definitively excluded. In theory, we recognize his, her humanity. In practice, he or she is, like the Negro at best, a second-class human who tries to dress and act like ourselves, but never quite manages to make the grade," end quote. Suffice it to say that Merton's awareness of the violence of structural racism and white privilege, white supremacy, allowed him to recognize the failures of ostensible white allies during the 1960s and beyond. He's pointing out that it's more than just your conscious intentions, more than my conscious intentions. There's more at work here. That's why he has to shout in all caps. Recognizing the deep-seated and complex reality of structural racism in America, Merton was distinctive among white Catholic clergy in his time to acknowledge what black women and men and other persons of color have known for centuries. And that is simply, racism is a white problem. Merton wrote in his famous essay, Letters to a White Liberal, that the work of Martin Luther King Jr. and Dr. King's fellow nonviolent activists was in part to help bring the social reality of the American context into white consciousness. Merton writes, "The purpose of nonviolent protest in its deepest and most spiritual dimensions is to awaken the conscience of the white man to the awful reality of his injustice and of his sin, so that he will be able to see that the Negro problem, as it's called, is really a white problem. The cancer of injustice and hate which is eating white society and is only partly manifested in racial segregation with all its consequences, is rooted in the heart of the white man himself. Only if the white man sees this will he be able to gradually understand the real nature of the problem and take steps to save himself and his society from complete ruin, end quote. Although for Merton, King's nonviolent protest was aimed at ushering in an awakening to racism and privilege, it did not succeed, even in the civil rights legislation that seemingly advanced racial justice in America at the time. I wish I had 4 or 5 hours or a whole course to talk about Merton's writings in this regard, because the examples, they speak through history to our time. It's a legacy of sin and injustice that persists now as well, largely because those responsible for both the harm and the possibility of change, namely, as Merton calls out correctly, white women and men, that so many of us refuse to accept even the most basic truths that people of color cannot escape. And that really is what white privilege means at its core, is that those who are identified like I am or look like Merton did have the luxury of escaping, pretending, ignoring, and denying. The reality of systemic racism covers it over and is, from Merton's perspective, the responsibility of white Christians in particular, due to their baptismal commitments, to embrace the painful but necessary cross of conversion and work to be better anti-racists. I'm going to circle back to that in a moment, but I want to say something about Merton's view of the kinship of creation, especially our recognition of the evil of climate change today. That Thomas Merton had a series of significant, even epiphantic experiences over his lifetime is not news to anyone even remotely familiar with Merton's lifelong experience of conversion. The map of Merton's life, a little bit of a tongue twister, is dotted with conversions, changes of heart, and an openness to the creative novelty of God's Holy Spirit at work in his life. Among the most celebrated is his so-called turn to the world, which began in the late 50s and continued to grow throughout the 1960s until his unexpected death in 1968. There's perhaps no better summary of the seeming shift in attention from his almost exclusive focus on the interior life of prayer to the external life of radical openness and solidarity to the world than that excerpt from the letter to Dorothy Day I shared earlier. This general movement and awakening to the social justice concerns in the world of his time anticipated the call of the Second Vatican Council's famous opening lines in Gaudium et Spes, according to which all Christians are called to celebrate the joys and hopes, as well as acknowledge and respond to the griefs and anxieties of all women and men of this age. Global climate change and environmental degradation are both the source of contemporary griefs and anxieties, as well as the symptoms of human sinfulness today. It was around that same time that Merton had an experience of what I would call ecological conversion and an awareness, a consciousness that blossomed into an acute attention to the environmental crises of his time, more than 50 years ago. As sisters Kathleen Dagnan and Monica Weiss, both scholars of Merton's work, among so many others, have noted, Merton's reading of Rachel Carson's important book, Silent Spring, in the early 1960s, and then the subsequent correspondence he had with her, reflect an explicit awakening to the ecological signs of the times. And yet, while the experience of turning to the world included non-human creation, in addition to the strife Merton witnessed among the human family, the late 1950s and early 1960s were not the first time he was aware of humanity's relatedness to the rest of creation or God's presence within it. I mentioned earlier when quoting Professor Trask's description of some Hawaiian intuitions from ancestral past and history, culture, and spirituality, that Merton would not have been super thrilled with the polytheism, right? He was a Christian, he was a monotheist, but he nevertheless was if not a pantheist, a panentheist, as St. Francis of Assisi and so many others are in the great Christian tradition. The difference 2 letters make. Panentheism simply means not that all of creation is a God, but that in and through all of creation, God is found. The Spirit of God draws near, not just to human beings, but to the whole family of creation. And like Pope Francis more recently, whose own vision of creation expressly is influenced by the Franciscan tradition, hint, 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 Merton's understanding of the natural world and humanity's place within it has always borne a certain Franciscan sensibility. In fact, Dr. Dagnan put it succinctly when she wrote, "In true Franciscan spirit, Merton could sense the angelic transparency of everything, of pure, simple, and total light." And I believe that this sensibility or spirit is seen in Merton's life and writings in two key ways. The first is his understanding of all creation as a vestige of God. Now, he gets that from St. Bonaventure, who he studied, especially in his late 20s. The word vestige is the root word of our description vestigial, like we think of our human appendix as a vestigial organ, something left behind. And that comes from the original Latin word vestigium, which means footprint, something that's left behind when we step away. It is the medieval Franciscan Bonaventure whose theological reflection on creation emphasized that everything that God created was, in a sense, a footprint, a vestige, had some imprint of the Creator. I love this image, and maybe because I'm a sitting target, I'm a Franciscan friar, so how can you not love this, right? But this idea that when God creates, there's an intimacy to everything that exists such that, like an artist who paints, has anyone ever, watch these documentaries about art forgers or these kinds of things, right? One of the ways art experts trace forgeries in real paintings are brushstrokes and imprints, things that are unique to the artist, but the artist is never aware of, but they're left behind. This idea of vestige is that God's fingerprints is found in everything. Everything that exists reflects or points back to the Creator who lovingly brought all creation into existence and whose very presence is capable of being recognized in that same creation. Merton writes about this in a 1967 letter. It's amazing. Merton wrote tens of thousands of letters. He truly never slept. Part of that is because he had a really bad back and he was in a lot of pain. But he was also writing to people who wrote to him, famous Nobel laureates, the Pope, heads of state, as well as random people. And in this case, there was a young Italian teenage boy who, for a school project, decided to take a chance and send an English letter to this monastery in the middle of Kentucky. Merton wrote back. And at one point, the young man asks him, "What is your view of the world?" And Merton says this in part, "My idea of the world. First of all, the world as God's good creation. I have the good fortune to live in close contact with nature. How should I not love this world and love it with passion?" Merton says, "I understand the joy of St. Francis amid the creatures. God manifests God's self in his creation, and everything that God has made speaks of him." End quote. The second way is Merton's understanding of the kinship of all of creation. Like Francis of Assisi and so many indigenous traditions around the globe, including here among the native Hawaiian communities, and still in a way anticipating Pope Francis's call for humanity to remember its familial ties to other creatures in Laudato Si. Merton had a deeply intuitive sense of his own ingrained relationship with the rest of the created order. This understanding of the world finds its roots in both the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, and is expressed most directly in the texts of nature mystics like St. Francis in his famous Canticle of the Creatures, in which non-human creation of the created order, other aspects of creation, are recognized and celebrated as our sisters and brothers. As another aside, I can't resist, Francis of Assisi was not a cute, romantic proto-hippie who was running around through the fields, singing songs, hugging trees, and high-fiving Clare of Assisi like you might see in Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. I don't think there was any high-fiving involved, but he was serious. He wasn't being cute. We can see how this impacted Merton in his journals, such as on November 4th, 1964, in which he writes, and I quote, "In the afternoon, lots of pretty warblers were playing and diving for insects in the low pine branches over my head, so close I could almost touch them. I was awed at their loveliness, their quick flight, and so on. Sense of total kinship with them, as if they and I were of the same nature, and as if that nature were nothing but love. And what else but love keeps all together in being?" End quote. This sense of kinship with the rest of creation doesn't just appear at the end of his life, but can be traced back to at least Merton's time as a young monk, with some examples we see in his earliest books like The Sign of Jonas and elsewhere. Professor Weiss has even suggested that Merton's awareness of the kinship of creation goes all the way back to his early childhood, as recorded by his mother, Ruth Jenkins Merton, who kept a very interesting journal about Merton as a little boy. I don't have time to get into this, but there's one passage where she remarks about how fascinated he was and spent more than an hour watching these little ants, tracing their journey, being zoned into their world. What this suggests to me is that Merton's ecological consciousness did not appear out of nowhere, but was an intuition located in the heart and mind of a young man who over time grew into greater awareness. The process of becoming increasingly open to all creatures as vestiges, as reflectors, as inheritors of the Creator and the kinship of all creation is what we might rightly name as a lifelong series of ecological conversions. Furthermore, I think these two aspects of Merton's ecological consciousness informed his ethical outlook as much as his simple appreciation for the world around him. This is something that grew from a seed of his spiritual environment in the early years into what we might imagine as a large tree that shaded his social justice concerns, especially near the end of his life. In one journal entry, Merton writes, "We do not realize that the fields and the trees have fought and still fight for the respective place on this map, which by natural right belong entirely to the trees." End quote. To me, that resonates with so many people, especially our indigenous sisters and brothers around the globe who fight for the rights of non-human creation. Here, Merton seems to recognize in the trees a sense of moral agency and subjectivity. They, the trees, they have a natural right. Who are we? They stand to exist. They have a right to be recognized as inherently valuable. And for those who may be thinking, oh, this sounds just a little too uncomfortable for me, I'm a Western European Christian thinker, I point to the highest teaching of the Roman Church, the encyclical letter of 2015, Laudato Si, from Pope Francis, where he also calls for us, for all who inhabit our common home, to recognize the inherent dignity and value of all God's creation, independently of human utility or consideration. And where does the Pope get that? Not just St. Francis. I mean, I know you're all thinking that. Yes, St. Francis, but also the Bible. In a way, reflecting both the ancient wisdom of the Hawaiian creational traditions here and anticipating the modern encyclical letter Laudato Si, Merton writes in a not well-known essay titled The Wild Places about Aldo Leopold's concept of ecological conscience. Merton says in this essay, Leopold brought into clear focus one of the most important moral discoveries of our time. This can be called the ecological conscience. The ecological conscience is centered in the awareness of humanity's true place as a dependent member of the biotic community. Men and women must become fully aware of their dependence on a balance which they are not only free to destroy, but which they have already begun to destroy. We must recognize our obligations toward the other members of that vital community. And incidentally, since we tend to destroy nature in our frantic efforts to exterminate other members of our own species, it would not hurt if we had a little more respect for human life too. The respect for life, the affirmation of all life, is basic to the ecological conscience, end quote. This notion strikes me as the well-formed object of the Christian call to ecological conversion Pope Francis lays before us. The late monk Thomas Merton recognized the connection between justice within the human family and justice for the larger family of creation. What Merton's journey reveals to us is a model for what ecological conversion looks like in a time of environmental and human crisis alike. And like Merton, each of us has the capacity to return to that deep creational intuition that affirms our shared kinship with the rest of creation and recognizes the presence of God in all creatures. Additionally, like Merton, we too can form our ecological consciences to recognize our interdependence and deep intersection between the injustices perpetuated against non-human aspects of creation and the injustices that affect human beings. Put in the words of Pope Francis, as well as the Brazilian theologian Leonardo Boff before him, Merton helps us to attend to both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. It strikes me from my limited knowledge of Native Hawaiian spiritualities that this is also deeply resonant with many of the traditions of this place and its peoples. The question now, as it has always been, is whether we will respond to that cry, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, or not. I believe that reading the writings of Thomas Merton, particularly those reflections on the natural world and those about systemic racism in our American context, may help to inspire us along the way of our journey of ecological and moral conversion, and to imagine better what such a pilgrimage of cosmic awareness entails in our interconnected reality. So let me land my plane this evening. In a sense, Merton's entire written corpus can be described as a reflection of ongoing conversion. Both his autobiographical text as well as his more kind of serious or reflective or didactic efforts identify numerous opportunities for what we in the Christian tradition call metanoia in Greek, a turning. And when you turn from and toward, turning from sin, individualism, or what Merton calls the false self, and toward reconciliation, communion, justice, and what he calls the true self. And this is the case in his writings on the violence of American racism and ecological conversion, wherein he almost always draws a connection between what Gaudium et Spes would call the signs of the times and our response as Christians to it. And I'm suggesting that we can read Merton's writings as the kind of beginning or a contribution to a spirituality of justice. Merton laments the Christian failure in American racial justice in his own time, noting that an increased awareness of what is happening in society brings out, as he says, the stark reality that our society itself is radically violent and that violence is built into its very structure. What is the response then of the Christian, especially the white Christian, supposed to be? I suggest in closing that Merton offers at least 3 points to be considered in our forming a spirituality of justice, especially for white Christians in the American context. First, Merton explains that the job of the white Christian is then partly a job of diagnosis and criticism, a prophetic task of finding and identifying the injustice which is the cause of all violence, as he puts it, both white and black. The exhortation is to resist simply resting in an unexamined complicity and instead seek to uncover the injustice already at work in the system. Merton explains that this leaves Christians, particularly white Christians, with a real choice, either to, as he says, and I quote, find security and order by falling back on antiquated and basically futile conceptions, or going forward into the unknown future, identifying themselves with the forces that will inevitably create a new society, end quote. This is the revolutionary dimension that challenges Christians to move outside the cocoon of personal piety and prayer to embrace a spirituality of praxis and engagement. This call to transformation is not only something that must be received on the personal level, but it also extends to the corporate Catholic Christian community. To consider our contemporary context, we could point to so many other examples where we see this play out, I think, in the failings of the church as a community whole together, especially in its leadership, to point out these signs of the times. And I have examples, but I want to move on. Second, Merton encourages his fellow white Christians to actually listen to their black sisters and brothers. Imagine that. Again, the central conviction of his famous essay, Letters to a White Liberal, is that the seemingly benevolent liberal, as he calls them, or northern whites in the mainland, are in fact deploying control and influence. Scholars like Derek Bell in decades that follow would describe as interest convergence. To put simply, and I'm oversimplifying this brilliant legal scholar's thought, things start to change when it's convenient, easy, or comfortable for those in power. For Merton, a spirituality of justice calls white Christians in particular to step aside and recognize the prophetic voice of women and men of color. Their message, he believed, can be put in simple terms, and I quote Merton here. He says, "I would say that the message is this. White society has sinned in many ways. It has betrayed Christ by its injustices to races it considers, quote, inferior, and to countries which it colonized," end quote. Merton adds, quote, "What is demanded of us," and he's speaking to fellow white Christians here, he says, "is not necessarily that we believe that the Negro has mysterious and magic answers in the realms of politics and social control, but that his or her spiritual insight into our common crisis is something we must take seriously," end quote. The spirituality of justice that Merton imagines is not one in which the prophetic voice arises from some white savior within American society, but one of humility and honest reflection that invites white Christians to embrace silence and openness. I have so many other examples, but I'm over and we started a bit late, so I'm going to fly through this here and say simply that Merton concludes that essay, Letters to a White Liberal, and if there's one thing you read from Merton that piques your interest today, I encourage you to look at that. He concludes with an instruction for what this might look like, invoking a familiar motif from the Gospels in the process, and he speaks to his fellow white Christians. He says, quote, "This is the message which the Negro is trying to give white America. In this essay, I have spelled it out for myself, subject to correction, in order to see whether a white man is even capable of grasping the words, let alone believing them. For the rest, you have Moses and the prophets, Martin Luther King, James Baldwin, and others. Read them and see for yourself what they are saying," end quote. But it's important for Christians who look like Merton and who look like me, who occupy a similar social location identified as white, to not limit ourselves to the experience of the great voices in the pantheon of racial justice in the 20th century like King and Baldwin and Malcolm X and others, though it is important for white women and men to read these very significant figures. Instead, we all must listen to our neighbors, co-workers, students and professors, cousins and relatives, strangers and friends. White people like me and like Merton must also read contemporary authors and listen, actually listen and hear accounts of experiences other than that which reflects our own privilege and therefore masks the reality of the subjugated and historically disenfranchised. The last point, the third point, to put it in my own words, is that white Christians should get out of the way. Articulated in first-person narrative, Merton concludes his essay, From Nonviolence to Black Power, with the following lines, quote, "I, for one, remain for the Negro. I trust him. I recognize the overwhelming justice of his complaint. I confess I have no right whatever to get in his way, and that as a Christian I owe him support, not in his ranks but in my own, among the whites who refuse to trust him or hear him and who want to destroy him," end quote. To experience transformation, to move toward actual racial justice, white Christians need to follow rather than lead, listen rather than instruct, and support our sisters and brothers of color on their own terms. For Thomas Merton, racial justice can only be imagined when those who benefit from maintaining the status quo of inequality recognize structural racism and its complement of white privilege. As Christians, we are called by virtue of our baptism to work for peace and justice, which according to Merton means that white women and men in the American context have to move toward surrendering the unearned privilege and power granted by structural racism. And that's not something that can be done easily or done simply or be done on an individual basis. Similarly, ecological conversion in an authentic response to global climate change can only take place with the privileged species, humanity, embracing a sense of creational humility. Merton highlights that for white Christians, this transformation begins with incorporating into their spiritual practices a commitment to identifying injustice, to calling it out, listening to women and men of color, and getting out of the way, so that the agenda and mission of social change can be set by the hitherto oppressed and not by the oppressor. He also notes that we must return to the ancient and true understanding of all humans as members of the singular family of creation, something that I believe aligns well with the wisdom of indigenous Hawaiian traditions. A spirituality of justice, a Catholic response to these harrowing signs of our times, requires putting one's faith into action in a manner that ought to discomfit the comfortable, humble the powerful, lift up the oppressed, and build the beloved community that Christians call the kingdom of God. Mahalo. Thank you.
I believe we have some time for question and answers. Friends, you'll really have to speak into the mic, otherwise it won't pick you up.
Well, we've got a bunch. All right.
With us here. I'm not the first person to say this, but it seems like Catholics are politically homeless. We don't really have anything that truly addresses our core values. I'm wondering, I suspect Merton would feel that way too. Where did he put himself on the political spectrum? I mean, or would he go off the board and say, none of this applies to me?
It's a great question. It's a bit anachronistic in some sense because Merton died more than 50 years ago, and so, I would even say how we understand ourselves in this country on the political spectrum 5 years ago has changed quite a lot too. That said, Merton was as Catholic can be, and the opening part of your question was an acknowledgement that there are no, and I'm not aware of any political party or organization in any nation or community around the globe that aligns perfectly with what it is we recognize as our values and commitments and the whole set of priorities. It's funny because I just filed my column for this week at NCR right before the lecture here. I just sent it off to my editor, and I talk about exactly this. I don't mention Merton, but this question that you're raising, what does it mean to be authentically Catholic in a context in which neither political party that's dominant in our society reflects our values? On the one hand, that means then I think it should alleviate some of the pressure that people have in feeling like they have to align with one or another and that one is, quote, more Catholic than another. That is nonsense. The U.S. bishops have said this. The Holy Father has said this. There's none that is more or less Catholic in this regard on the whole. On the other hand, I think where Merton falls into this is a model for how we should live as Catholic Christians in a pluralistic, what we might call secular society in which all voices and perspectives are welcome and ought to be heard and welcome. What does that mean? It means exactly what Merton did. It's not how does our Catholic values shape the common discourse, the common laws, the common culture for everybody as if this were a Catholic kingdom in the Middle Ages. But rather, how do our Catholic values, commitments, and well-formed consciences shape our action in this pluralistic society? The thing that occasioned my reflection this week is the persistence of the horrific treatment of our sisters and brothers who are asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants, especially on the mainland southern border. I think many of us have seen the images of how the Haitian migrants have been treated, and this under a very different political administration than the previous. So your other part of the question was, where does Merton fit on any of this? And I'd say nowhere, because Catholics don't fit on this spectrum. It doesn't mean we're not politically engaged. In fact, the Holy Father says both in Fratelli Tutti, the most recent encyclical, and in Laudato Si, that we are to be engaged politically and socially. But it's not for us to convert, quote unquote, our governmental system and our neighbors and everything into our religious tradition. It's about how do we relate to one another as informed by our tradition. And I hope that this is why I was so excited to share Merton's insights, just a little taste of them this afternoon, because I think, as the title of today's lecture puts it, it is precisely a Catholic response. It's not the only one, it's a Catholic response, not the Catholic response. Because Merton, as a Roman Catholic priest and monk and writer, models for us what I hope each of us can do, both in these two topics of structural racism and climate change, but really in all facets of our life. That's a great question. Thank you.
Father Dan, first of all, I really want to acknowledge your sensitivity to what is in Hawaii. I love how you opened your presentation today, but I don't even realize, I think, that you realize how much that was very healing and supportive of the pain that is here. And for you to do it so eloquently and honestly and from your heart, that was a very, very powerful thing. And I really want to acknowledge that and thank you for that. My heart is heavy tonight because a lot of the things that you raised, it feels as a church that we are weighed down by so much of this. You know? Sorry. I feel that there is so much heaviness in the church today in terms of the role that we've played in so much of this. You know, in the whole understanding of creation and the sovereignty, you know, of and that picture, that whole direction. How do you acknowledge that? And you know, the whole thing about slavery and how much we played a part of that in terms of the European, you know, approach there, that made that, you know, that the doctrine comes out of the Spanish church. How do we feel about? And you know, I know I'm making more of a sharing with you some of what you touched when you were talking. The other piece is the whole pedophilia thing, and how we as priests and, you know, people who are leaders, how do we? It's just such a weight, and I love how you I just loved your approach with Thomas Merton. I also feel very, very powerful. But when you were talking this evening, you know, these are the kinds of things that I felt, that just the real heaviness in the church that I feel, and for myself and for, you know, when I come to church, feels that a lot. And I'd just like you to respond. Or
Thank you, and thank you for everything, the heartfelt sharing and the resonance. I too feel the heaviness. The two topics that, you know, it almost feels like an injustice itself to not be able to go deeper, and not just one or the other, and to do two, and to do, you know, to not do full justice to either of these two very heavy topics. And you brought up another one as well, the sex abuse crisis in history in our church, as well as, you know, tied to our history of white supremacy and structural racism. It's different, I understand. I've tried to learn and will continue to seek learning about the various waves of racial injustice and forms of mistreatment of populations, East Asian populations, the relationship to other cultures, to the U.S. mainland, and so forth. But you mentioned chattel slavery, the sexual abuse crisis. These are all heavy, heavy issues. So I have a couple thoughts. The first is Pope Francis, I think, models well some of this in something that he says often, and I think he said often throughout the 8 years of his pontificate so far. It's captured kind of explicitly in Laudato Si with regard to climate change and the environmental degradation we experience today and the human root of that ecological crisis. And he cautions people not to shut down, that it can seem so big. These topics we're talking about are so big. As you say, there's the weight of it. People can and have been crushed by it. And so on the one hand, he says, because there's a way we can individually and collectively let ourselves off the hook, write ourselves a get out of jail free card, right? Oh, climate change, look at all the terrible things that are happening even now, let alone impossible for a refusal of people to imagine 20, 30, 100 years from now. It's scary. And so it's too overwhelming. I'm just going to shut down. What can one person do? I already recycle, so I'm going to watch some Netflix, But substitute climate change for any one of the topics you raised. And what I think Pope Francis does is encourage us, not just Catholics, but especially Catholics and all people of goodwill, to not be overwhelmed by that, to start somewhere, and to remember, at least as Christians, and this is something St. Paul says over and over again, famously in the letters to the Romans, build one another up. We have to do it as a community. We can't do it by ourselves. That said, all the topics that you've just named and that we've been discussing, there's one common thread, and that is a failure for us as a collective society. There are some people who cannot escape the truths and the realities and the experiences, as we were reflecting on earlier. But by and large, especially those who are in power, institutional power, ecclesiastical power, political power, refuse to face the truth. Climate change continues to be the pressing concern because those who are the greatest polluters, those who have the greatest agency to do something, as societies refuse to do it. Us, we're part of it. Systemic racism will never be changed, because it's a white problem and white people refuse to acknowledge that it's real, and furthermore, pretend as if 400 years of the enslavement of our sisters and brothers never happened and doesn't continue to happen. The clergy sex abuse crisis is the same thing, and I'm speaking here as a Roman Catholic priest and as a Franciscan friar, as a religious. We do not talk about this enough, and there are practical reasons for that too. I think bishops and clergy and lay people are scared sometimes. Our country, for all of its greatness, also has a lot of shadow sides, one of which is a very litigious society. So it's hard to reconcile when people are afraid to say I'm sorry or to take responsibility for fear that it's going to cause bankruptcy. I hate to be so practical, but let's be honest. So all the way down, I feel like we have to risk the vulnerability of truth. I mentioned only briefly in passing something that comes from now, sadly, the late German theologian Johann Baptist Metz, a student of Karl Rahner and one of the fathers of Catholic political theology, really kind of on the forefront of what became South American and then Black liberation theology. And he coined this term, dangerous memories, that we refuse. Think about it as Christians, as Roman Catholics in particular, we dare to put the dead body of an executed, accused criminal as the sign of our faith. And we treat this, we put it on our necks, we hang this on our walls, and we don't think about the dangerous memory that that symbolizes. Metz says that until we confront the dangerous memories and face them, call them to mind, share them, and tell the stories, we're going to be doomed to repeat these things. And we see that play out in all the ways that you so heartfeltly named. And there are many others. I mean, I think about the injustice. It's partially, it intersects with other forms of injustice, how unjust our incarceration system is, the irony of calling it the justice system. And it's being prompted in part by the fact that we dare to worship a God who was killed by the state. And yet, capital punishment is still legal in this country. We're in good company with Iran and China and a couple other places, right? I'm getting a little bit on my soapbox, but I am at a pulpit, so I guess it's appropriate. There's more to say, and I appreciate you naming them, and I think that's maybe the best place to leave it for now is to name the weightiness, the heaviness, and to build one another up, to support one another in that acknowledgement and confronting that truth, because until we do that, nothing's going to change. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Father Haran. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I'll be honest, I didn't thoroughly read the Thomas Merton reading. I kind of skimmed over it, but I did read some of his readings in college and in the past. I don't know if my question is a question, but it's just thoughts, some of the notes I wrote. I 100% agree with what Thomas Merton wrote, but it was up to 1968, so it's more about black and white and indigenous Americans. But I want your thoughts on America today with the impact of social media 24/7 and how there is a shift in racism in America based on the geopolitical climate worldwide, with the Asians and even African Americans, because as a military brat, I lived in the South in the 60s, and I'll be honest, some of my parents' best friends were African American. And my father was a New Englander, but he was an Irish immigrant, and they were low on the social hierarchy, the pecking order of white people. They were considered the social outcasts. So I guess my question is, racism in America and globally, is it changing? I mean, it's not just a black-white thing anymore. I think it's everything. After 9/11, my Hindu friends were targeted at the airport. Their house was targeted because they were being harassed, being told, it's your fault that 9/11. So I think being raised as a Catholic, I mean, this is very simplistic, but all my nuns and all my priests and my father, he raised me, Mary, in life, you're going to come across all different types of people, very trite, very simple, but judge a book by its content, not its cover. And that's the creed I've lived by. And in all my classes, wherever I taught my students, it's what's on the inside. It's education. So like in our U.S. history books, they gloss over what happened to the Hawaiian people. They gloss over a lot of social injustice in Myanmar and all over the globe, the Holocaust, everything, the indigenous Americans. So I think it's our charge to educate and maybe find different textbooks. And if we don't have different textbooks, then we as educators or administrators or whatever we're doing is to teach our children and to educate our parents. Even the language we use, we need to stop it. We are all one. We're all created by God. And even the respect for the environment and nature. My mother's Japanese. My dad was Haole Caucasian from New England, Irish. We were always taught to respect nature because my mom was Japanese and Shinto, which is polytheistic, respect for nature, even though in Japan during World War II was used for a terrible cause, but that was the government. So I don't know what my question is. My question is, why can't we be a colorless society after so many years? I'm getting emotional because this is, whether I'm teaching English, social studies, world religions, world cultures, that is our goal as educators, whether it be college, preschool. We are all God's creatures. You don't say, oh, you're Filipino, or you're Hapa. You might not even know these words, or you're on the East Coast, oh, you're a Mick, Irish or whatever. We are God's creatures, and God created us, and he loves all of us regardless. And it comes down to education and parents and some of the television shows and just, real quick, I know you have a million other questions, but my own daughter, she looks super Asian. She was in a CVS in Dallas, Texas with her black roommate. The cashier followed her black roommate, whose family was super affluent. And my daughter Ashley goes, "Hey, you should be following me. I'm dirt poor. My mom's a teacher," So I'm just saying, people are still judging by what's on the outside. And what do? Is it up to the education system and better textbooks? Thank you. Thank you, sorry.
No, you're
On my soapbox.
That was great. Thank you. Let me say amen to most of your reflection. And I think, you asked as you started, is this a question? I think you actually gave us it's like Jeopardy. You gave us the answer. And now what is the question? And the question in part is, what are the resources? I think education is exactly right, and it piggybacks on the earlier conversation about dangerous memory and our failure to accept reality. Just briefly, a couple of things. One is, you asked early on in your remarks about, is racism changing globally, social media, these sorts of things, are they impacting that? I think it's important for us to always remember that racism is always about power. And it's power that's assigned to or deprived from based on something totally arbitrary, and as you said it a moment ago, our outsider, the book cover, as you said, right? So we talk about phenotype, or we talk about skin color, or we talk about nation of origin, or family of origin, or language of origin, geographic region. You mentioned, and it's very true, the fluidity of whiteness. We didn't have time this afternoon, this evening, but something that I think is really important is that because of the dynamics of white supremacy in the U.S. context, and I didn't get into it globally, but you named some, and I think there are others, not only the suffering in Burma and elsewhere, but I think of the Uyghurs in China, and I think about other minoritized communities and religions and ethnic groups around the globe. So the key thing there is power, who has it and who doesn't. This is why we use the term minoritized, because sometimes it's not minority, we think of as percentages. Well, in South Africa, the majority were people of color, black South Africans. And yet, those who were white, those who were descendants of the colonizers, were the ones who held the power in the unjust system of apartheid. In the US, I think there's a lot of anxiety among certain populations of people who look like me who are realizing that the demographics are switching. And when you let that be a clue about the deeply insidious persistence of racism. Why are people so nervous? Well, because if your whole world's shaped by judging books by their covers, or people by their skin tone, or their place of origin, or their ethnic heritage, and you assume that the numerical majority is what gives you power, then all of a sudden things start to seem very uncomfortable. I think there's so much more to say. You touched on so many important things. I think it's important to realize that as long as we remember that, about the whiteness, that whiteness is a social construct too. Who gets to be white in the United States? Well, tell me the year, and I'll give you a couple categories. I am Irish in heritage on both sides of my family. And like you said about your father, there was some point in the 19th century and prior where my ancestors would not have been considered white. Tell that to the sun as I'm burning and turning red and pink here in Hawaii. But all jokes aside, race is socially constructed. It's arbitrary. And when we start talking about the ways in which communities come together and loving relationships form like parents and children of multiracial backgrounds and ethnic heritages, what does it even mean anymore? And you see again how we categorize people. Notice how I was referring to President Obama as of African descent. He's not just black. He's not just African, right? His mother came from Kansas, presented as white as well. She's white. So what does that mean? But in the United States, somebody who has a white parent and an African American parent is called black. He's as much white as black, right? I bring that up because the arbitrariness of racism, and at the end of the day, it's about who has power, how it's used, and where the benefits and the disadvantages are accrued or deployed because of that. And I guess I'll close because I'm realizing we're running out of time, is just to give a great amen to your point about education. And we see that you're so spot on. You're so spot on that you see that that's the frontier of the great divisions in various states and places around our nation today. Why are people using race and how we tell the story of our history as the dividing point? And it's in schools and in curriculums and these sorts of things. I think that points back to the intuition that you have here. And so it is about education, and it goes back to this point about Johann Baptist Metz, the dangerous memory, the truth. And there are a lot of people in power, a lot of people who look like me, who don't want the truth taught. Truth. I'm getting cut off. It's like the Oscars. They're going to run the music. Yvonne is saying. And anyways, I should stop there. Thank you. Yes.
Father, I think we have time for at least one
Absolutely.
more question.
I have time for as long as people want.
The last one.
Okay, brother. Okay. Thanks.
Hi, Father Dan. Thank you so very much for your lecture. Very interesting, very illuminating. I am a deacon. I serve at a parish that we have a lot of multi-ethnic community. Well, it's a multi-ethnic parish. We have a lot of ethnic communities, and we are blessed to have big families, lots of people of different colors, and it's just great. But one thing that you touched on, the thought of personhood, that I as a deacon I'm confronted with frequently, especially among the young adults, is that I'm privileged in the sense that I can tell them, in Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself. And we need to participate in that. But when I tell them that, some of them tell me, well, then you are trying to define what kind of person I am by saying that. And I think a lot stems from the fact that they don't know that Christ was a Jew, that he was a minority, that God became man in this very poor neighborhood, and he was a poor man. But there's a point in their argument, and I need your help. There's a point in their argument, and I need your help in that. I need your help to tell me how to answer their question better.
In the pandemic age with masks, and I have a little bit of a hearing problem, so I hope I got it. So please, afterwards we can talk if I didn't catch it all. That's an interesting thing about the personhood and the determination of personhood. If we had more time, I would get into a lecture about theological anthropology and Christology, two of my favorite topics. In short, I would say that I think you're on the right track. You're already providing a good answer, though it's not, maybe to young people, not always compelling, right? Not always convincing. And I think maybe even to lean into that a bit deeper. Not only, so when we talk about Jesus of Nazareth, the historical Jesus, we talk about God becoming human in this person in time, as Christ, Jesus of Nazareth at this moment, the Christ. But it's interesting in John's prologue that the words that are used in Greek are not, and God became man. So ladies out there, you can realize it's not man. It's also the word didn't become human. Now we're all starting to get a little uncomfortable. The Greek is, and the word, the logos, became sarx, flesh. Now why is that important? That's important because the Greek word sarx is like the Hebrew word adamah in Genesis 1 and 2. And what is sarx? It's flesh, it's earthiness, it's materiality. So for the scientists in the room or on the Zoom, what that means is it's an ancient Greek way of saying, in our Gospel of John, that when God entered into our history, God didn't just become one person, right? Obviously, God did in Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ. But God took on, right, in that reconciliation of all things unto God's self in Christ, right, which comes from the New Testament epistles, that Christ brings into Christ's self, into God's self, all of creation. So, for instance, in chapter 8 of the letter to the Romans, Paul talks in this weird line that makes some people uncomfortable, especially when we're anthropocentric, when we think everything's about us and our species. There's this weird line where Paul talks about all of creation is groaning for that day of salvation. Well, that's curious. Or when in the book of Job, which is awesome, everyone focuses on Job's plight. Why? Because Job is a whiny brat. How all these things are happening to me, why me, and all right, it's tough, we get it. The whole thing's a little bit uncomfortable because it seems a little masochistic on God's part. But anyways, but if you get to the end of the book of Job, particularly in chapters 36 to 38, 39, there are these two powerful speeches which God directs directly to Job. And God says that I know and have a relationship to all of these creatures. It's not just about you, Job, as an individual or as a species, as a human. Where am I going with this? Is to say that Christ's, the power of God's love manifested most completely in the incarnation, which is what we as Christians proclaim, is broad enough, capacious enough, big enough for every single creature God loves into existence in their particularity. And so there's some way that our young people feel as if the Christian message, our Christian theology, is boxing them in and they all have to be kind of photocopies of Jesus, that defeats the whole purpose of the incarnation. Because in the becoming of flesh, the sarx, the word becoming flesh, God takes on all of creation, as you said, and as the New Testament proclaims. So every woman, man, and person, and every non-human creature is enveloped in that love of God in Christ Jesus. For us as humans, we have certain responsibilities where we talk about being co-creators with God, and we are agents with free will. What that, my Franciscan theologian hat on, what that means is we shouldn't be dictating what the life of squirrels and mosquitoes and whales and sharks are like. We don't know. But God has a relationship to them. If you don't believe me, read the book of Job. What we need to do is attend to our business because, and maybe this is a good way to land the Q&A plane, is to think about the fact that we are the ones who are responsible for the great devastation that's happening on this planet. Period. We are. The fish aren't. The trees aren't. We are. And we as a species, as a community, as the human family, are so vulnerable and so interdependent, and we are so arrogant. We are like the little teenage brats that I once was when I was a teenager. I obviously don't have kids, but those of you with kids, you know what it's like. And those of you who were teenagers, you know what it's like. Everything is about our own world. We think we're autonomous, we think we're in charge, we think we can set everything up, and yet we forget how quickly we're dependent on our family and our communities and our parents and our schools and our teachers and so forth. As a species, we can do nothing on our own. How arrogant are we? The breath that we're taking, or that you're taking haltedly through your masks, comes from the hard work of this green plant life around us. We do nothing but breathe out poison. We can't even sustain ourselves in breath. We can't make our own food. At least the trees are producing fruit that's edible. What's the last edible thing you produced? We can't clothe ourselves. We can't shelter ourselves. We can't do anything. The medicines, everything that we rely on that we think is our own creation is part of and a reflection of the interdependence of all of God's creation. And so I went way off of your question about Christology and human personhood, but I think I bring that up because part of the challenge that I think we need to present to ourselves individually and to one another and to the next generations is that God's love is so great that it's not limited to any individual. and that our role in this community is not just to take care of ourselves first and then with leftover energy and time and resources to help others, but to recognize that our very existence is sustained by God's community of creation, and we have a right, we have an obligation, we have a duty to offer something in return. We are the prodigal children in that parable of the environment. We are the younger son and daughters who take and take and take. We go off and we squander it, and we go back and we want to take some more. I think that God's love is big enough for all of God's children, human and non-human alike, and that I hope that in thinking about Christ's entrance into our history as being something transformative for all of creation, as you said, reconciling the whole world, all of God's creation unto God's self, his invitation for our young people in particular to see themselves in God's family of creation. So thank you. I know that went long, and thank you for your patience and for your listening. And I could say more, but so thank you for letting me cut short. Thank you.
Father Dan, I think I speak on behalf of all of us here and those at home. We're very grateful for your ability to guide us in reflecting on these difficult issues and allowing us time to dialogue with you. Thank you again. Friends, if you would spare me a couple more minutes, there are a few things that I'd like to do before we conclude our time together. I'd like to invite up to the podium Jane Mondoy, who serves as Director of Adult Formation for the Diocese of Honolulu and is a member of our Marianist Lecture Committee, who has a short presentation to give.
Friends, this year we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Marianist Lecture, formerly the Mackey Marianist Lecture. With this significant milestone, we're pleased to recognize Father Dan Haran as the first recipient of the Mackey Award for Catholic Thought, named in honor of Father Robert Mackey of the Society of Mary, and the first president of Chaminade University, and an important voice in the civic and religious community of Honolulu. Father Dan, your prophetic work to illuminate the inherent dignity of the human person and creation as inspired by Thomas Merton, and so eloquently shared with us this evening, exemplifies the purpose of the Marianist Lecture to advance the spirit, charism, and educational mission of the Society of Mary and Marianist family. With this, Father Dan, we present to you this umeke, or bowl. Thank you. This umeke is made of mango wood. And you know, the umeke is often the centerpiece of the family table, more than utilitarian. Each umeke is unique and a treasured symbol for feasting, sharing of meals, and the dynamics and continuance of familial and cultural histories and values. Similarly, we gather here on the slopes of Kalaepohaku as a Marianist family to feast upon the words of wisdom of our presenters, share in inclusive dialogue in the context of our diverse cultures and values, and be inspired to make our church and our world a better place through our prophetic witness. Father Dan, may this umeke be a continual reminder of your Marianist family here in Hawaii, who seek to live the spirit of humility and justice and Mary's Magnificat to say yes to God's call. Congratulations, Father Dan.
Before we conclude, I do need to say thank you to a couple of individuals who have helped make this event possible. To the members of the Marianist Lecture Committee, among them Dr. Helen Turner, Dr. Dustin Ragasa, Jane Mondoy, Joseph Nugent, and Mario Callejas. And also a big thank you to the three sponsors of today's lecture, namely St. Louis School, Chaminade University, and the Marianist Center of Hawaii. We're also very grateful to our technical staff, Yvonne Wilbacher, Rhea Quemado for the live stream, Mario Callejas and the University Communication Office for the publicity, and for those who have helped with today's event. Oh, and also myself. And lastly, we're very grateful for all of you joining us here in person and those of you online. We're very grateful for your ability to participate with us. And lastly, I'd like to invite Dr. Helen Turner, who has one last presentation before we conclude.
Good evening, everyone. A couple minutes to do something important. So I'm delighted to be asked today to offer a few remarks to honor Brother Dennis Schmitz, SM, for his work in organizing the Mackey, now the Marianist Lectures, for the last 25 years. Brother Dennis, please. Two reflections on Brother Dennis's contribution as the shepherd of this lecture series. First, these Marianist lectures are about Catholic thought and Catholic responsibility. Over the years I've been at Chaminade, Brother Dennis has brought us speakers who reflect that duality. We've heard, yes, about Catholic thought, about the inspiration, these high concepts, the intellectual tradition that animates us and inspires us as Catholics. It's always been balanced by a treatment of Catholic responsibility. What are the calls to action in the world that accompany our traditions and our scholarship, faith and works? My second thought is on 25 years. I don't want to make you feel old. It's too late. St. Bruno tells us the beautiful motto of the Carthusians: the cross stands as the world turns. The world's turned a lot in 25 years, maybe not as much as we would have hoped, but it has turned. But these lectures have stood the test of time, and they continue to read the signs of the times as you guided them to do for 2.5 decades. So Brother Dennis, on behalf of our community of faith and all those that have been touched by these lectures for 25 years, I keep just hammering that point, I'm going to present you with a commemorative edition of the Olelo No'iau, curated by Mary Pukui, a native Hawaiian scholar, a mana wahine, and a kupuna. There's an Olelo No'iau, which is, He ike ana e ai kapono. You saw the right thing, and you did it. Thank you.
And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our program this evening. And so we say thank you very much, and may God bless you all, and please drive safely home. Good night.